Welcome to the Workspace Master Class. I'm Dan Fellow, Lead Workspace Architect. And previously we've had master classes focused on virtual apps and desktops, Zen App and Zen Desktop, or Zen Mobile Endpoint Management. What this is going to do is the environment's evolving. So a virtual app or a desktop or a mobile application is just becoming part of the greater overall workspace. And so what we want to do is try to bring all these things together into a master class because they all interrelate. And we're going to talk about this as well as many other things within this master class session. The agenda, or basically the things that we want to go over, is we still want to provide some technical updates on some of the more point-specific products within the workspace. So this will be a little bit of time. Then we're also going to then start diving into a workspace. Let's understand what a workspace is and what comprises a workspace. And some of those things are going to be Workspace App, Site Aggregation, and Access Control. We'll talk about these things conceptually and then go through live demos to see what the user experience is as well as what the admin experience is going to be to actually set up and configure the workspace. Now, we only have an hour and a half, and I'm hoping to have some time at the end for Q&A, so we can't hit upon everything that's part of the workspace. But this is what I'm hoping to get through today. And then sometime in the future, there's going to be other topics all related around workspace and how they integrate to build a user's workspace that we'll focus on at a later date. But let's first get into here and talk about the updates. And for those of you who might not be aware, we have name changes going on. So Zen App is now Citrix Virtual Apps, Zen Desktop is Citrix Virtual Desktops, and so on, as you can see on the screen. Now, the whole point of this is to make it easier to understand, make it easier for other people, those who aren't, don't have the background of Citrix, to actually understand what these different point solutions do. So if you hear the term Zen App, you don't really know what that is. But Citrix Virtual Apps, like, oh, it's a virtual app, that makes sense. And even Zen Server, Citrix Hypervisor, it's very straightforward, very easy to understand exactly what this capability, what this product does, based on the name of the product. The next thing is versioning strategy. So those of you who've been doing this for a while know that we started with Zen App, 7.6, 7.7, 7.8, and so on. And we're releasing a virtual, we're releasing Zen App and Zen Desktop now, virtual apps and virtual desktops, every quarter. So 4 times a year we're going to have a new version. So in 1 year you'd be going from 7.16, 7.17, 7.18, and 7.19. It's really difficult with that type of a versioning strategy to understand or to think about when that actual version was released. Is 7.18 the current, or is there another one? So what we're doing now is changing this around. So there is no 7.19. What would have been 7.19 is 18.08. So how you break this down is to the first 2 numbers are the year, and the last 2 numbers is the month. So 2018-08 is when this next version of virtual apps and desktops came out. So for those of you who are familiar with Windows 10 releases, it's very similar to how Windows 10 is going because, to date, there's been 5 or 6 different Windows 10 releases, but they're all using the year and month format. So the last Windows 10 update was 18.03, and I believe we're on the cusp of 18.09 for Windows 10. So we're following a very similar strategy just to make it easier to understand when these releases came out. Now I want to actually focus a little bit on the virtual apps and desktops, the 18.08 release. Focus on a couple of the new capabilities that have been introduced within this release. The first thing is logon duration. So in Director, we've had this capability for a while. Being able to see how your logon is breaking down. How long it take to broker your session, for the VM to start, to connect, authenticate GPOs, login scripts, and so on. The problem was there's a thing on the end called interactive session. And this is usually where the brunt, the most time is going to be spent in your session being created and the user logging on. But what does that actually mean? What is the interactive session? And if you don't know what that is, how do you optimize it to try to reduce that number? So in the 18.08 release, what we can do is now dig a little deeper into the GPOs and interactive session. So for the GPOs, we can be looking at registries, Citrix group policy, Citrix profile management, to see how long it took each one of those different GPOs to get applied. And also, the next part is the interactive session. So is this the pre, or is the user initialization? Is it the shell? Any type of delays? So we're able to get more information on what constitute or what slowed down the overall interactive session. And we can try to see, is there any way for us to better optimize the interactive sessions or the GPOs? If you have 10 GPOs, is it impacting your logon time? And if so, which GPO is it? Like, which aspect of the GPO is it? Is it the the Citrix policy portion, or is it the registry settings that are being applied? So you'll be able to get some of this information from the new director reports within the 1808 release. The next thing is better throughput. So we're always looking at how do we optimize ICA? How do we optimize the protocol so we can get a better user experience? And this is really, again, for high latency connections. And high latency, I'm only talking about 50, 150 millisecond latency, which is not that high yet. But so basically what's happening here is we're able to optimize it to send more information across the wire when latency increases by changing some of the buffering that's happening on the server as well as the client. So what you see here is the gray line there is before the optimization. And it's pretty steady across the board. It doesn't peak very high because we're limited based on the previous configurations. Now, after the optimizations that were introduced in the 1808, optimizations for ICA, you can see we're getting much higher overall bandwidth on the same session, on the same test. So what this equates to is that we're able to get the same amount of data sent across the wire much faster. So that's why you see the blue line going really high and then dropping below the gray line, because that gray line is taking longer to send the same amount of data. So the blue line, we send it across and then we don't have to send anything. We send a bunch across, then we can back off. So the overall improvement on throughput is going to have a noticeable increase for the overall user experience. So in some of the tests that we did, if you look at just sending 400 megabytes of data from the server down to the client, with a latency of just 50 milliseconds, it was 424 seconds to do this. After the optimization, that 424 seconds dropped down to 186 seconds. When the latency increased to 150 milliseconds, again, it went from 1,200 seconds down to 520. So a huge improvement when you send data from the server to the client. Now let's look at the flip side of this. 400 megabytes from the client to the server. And the improvements here are even greater than server to client. So client to server, we're seeing 300 seconds down to 45, 900 seconds down to 52. This is a 7 and a 17 times improvement for sending the same amount of data over the line based on some of the new optimizations and new optimizations put into ICA and with the Virtual Apps and Desktops 1808 release. So another big improvement when it comes to ICA. And if you've been paying attention over the last quarters, many quarters, we keep moving that bar. We keep improving ICA because there's always room to improve the user experience when it comes to a Virtual Apps and Desktops environment. Something else to be aware of is something that's called app probes. So what would typically happen is a user and an endpoint is going to make a connection to a published application or a published desktop. And if it's unavailable for some reason, the servers are offline or there's something wrong with the environment, what's going to happen is the user's just going to get an error message that they can't access the application. And this is going to happen to not just one user, but every user who tries to access it. And all of a sudden, the help desk gets overwhelmed with all these calls coming in. What we'd like to be able to do is be a little bit more proactive, like continuously test to see if resources are available within the environment. So we take an endpoint and we install a probe on that endpoint. And this probe is going to allow us to control how it's going to test via the configuration in Director. So we're going to set, this is the resource we want to test from these different endpoint devices that are running the probe, and we want the test to happen at this time every day. So the probe is then going to go out, contact Storefront, launch the application, and test to see if there's any issues with authenticating and logging in and launching the published application. Let's go ahead and see how app probes work, how they're configured by doing this in a demo. We're going to go on our endpoint device, and this would be like one of many endpoint devices we would use that would be defined as a probe. So on each one of these devices, we have to install the probe agent. And the configuration of this is pretty easy. You identify the URL for the storefront server, and you give it an identity and password, a username and password that's going to be used to authenticate and launch one of the applications. Now, this identity has to have rights to that application. The app has to be published to that user. All this configuration information is coming from Director. So we need to configure the probe to have the address for Director. Because that's where the probe goes out to Director to get the configuration of when it should launch the probes and the configuration for each of those probes. And again, we need the right credentials, probably an administrator that has access to Director. And you can go ahead and validate this, and it's going to make sure that the user account you've specified as well as the URL is correct so that the probes will work. With the probe created, or our endpoint machines installed with the probe agent, we have to go and modify storefront just to make sure that the HTTP basic is enabled for our storefront site, because that's how the probe is going to be authenticating for our published app with HTTP basic. We also need to go into Director. Like I said, Director is being used to configure the probes. So you have to go into Director, log in, and we're going to go ahead and do the configuration. So there's when we look at the applications, you'll see a list of published applications that we have within the environment. To go ahead and configure a probe, we select the configuration tab, a new tab that we have at the top in Director. And in here, we're going to go ahead and create the probe, and we just enter in the parameters. What's the name of this particular probe, the application, the endpoint machine that we're running the probe on. If you want to have an email go out, if there's going to be errors of that, you can specify that. And then you also have to configure the time. What time in the day is this probe going to execute? Now we just have to wait for the time to pass of when this probe is supposed to execute. So if I've got the times correct, or very similar to what it is, now what you'll be able to see is a user. We now have an instance. Someone is using our application Word right now. And the user is the user that we specified on the probe. So on our endpoint device, when we configured the probe, we specified a user account. That user has now logged on. So the probe is validating that it has access to this application. Eventually, this session is going to disappear because the system's validated that the user was able to log on and launch the application. And when the session goes away, then you're going to be able to see whether the probe was a success or a failure, and be able to get that back in Director. Okay, so the session has now disappeared. And if we go back into Director and look at the applications, we can see that the probe result for Word, we have one probe that has passed. It's successful. So that application does work from that particular endpoint. So those are just a couple of the quick updates that I wanted to talk about. An 1808 just came out not that long ago. So, but I really want to focus the greatest percentage of this masterclass on Workspace. And you're hearing Workspace a lot more. But when I started hearing this, it was like, exactly what is my Workspace? What is it? And I wanted to kind of set the stage of what a user's Workspace is. So the first thing, it's not new. We've had workspaces for a really long time, and in fact, my original workspace, this is my first digital workspace, and yes, we're going old school here. This is Windows 3. Everything I needed was here. All of my applications, all of my data, Everything was on that one PC, and that's the only PC I had. So this was my digital workspace. Unfortunately, everything's much more complex now. It's so much more complex than it was when we were back in the Windows 3.x days. And let me explain why. So here you have a user. And if a user's anyone, a typical user, you have a tablet, you have a laptop or a PC, and you have a phone. Now, you have 3 devices, maybe more. Each one of those devices is potentially running a different platform, a different operating system, Android, Windows, and iOS. In fact, this is kind of how my environment is. I have many different operating systems running on my different devices. Now, 3 devices and 3 different operating systems, it's not that big of a deal. But you have to configure each one of your applications specifically for that different device. So first, you got to get the app. Do you get the executables, or do you go to the Android store or the Apple store? And then when you configure it, is the configuration the same or different across those different devices? But like I said, configuring my device, it's not that hard. It doesn't take that long. The challenge and really the annoying thing is first, we're getting more and more different applications that have to be configured on these endpoint devices. And second, about every 2 years, you're getting a new device. And getting a new device might mean that you're changing the operating system. And regardless of whether you do or not, you have to go back and reconfigure that device. So when you get rid of your iPad and you might go to a Surface, you have to reconfigure. You have to redeploy those applications and reconfigure those applications on that new device. You also have to deal with all of your settings, all the configurations, all your profile information, how is everything working together, all your favorites, all this information that those of us who've done virtual apps and desktops before understand. It's different. How you do it in a workspace environment is different, but the concepts are the same. How do we make the user experience move? How do we have the user's workspace be available on any device, regardless of what that device is, what the operating system is, who owns the device, am I changing the device out, am I upgrading the device? So how we can do this is we basically are moving the workspace, essentially, for lack of a better term, we're virtualizing the workspace. Each one of those devices is a workspace. You have a user interface where all your applications are and all the configurations are. So your tablet is your tablet workspace. You have a laptop workspace, and you have a phone workspace. You have 3 different workspaces. With Citrix Workspace, the whole concept is, again, like I said, lack for a better term, is you virtualize this. You're pulling that workspace environment off of those devices and moving it into a cloud service. And that's the workspace experience. So now the workspace contains all of your favorite applications, all the configured applications for your environment. So now I can easily swap out devices, and I still have the exact same user experience. I still have the exact same configuration of all of my applications and resources. So this really gets us down, for the virtual apps and desktops, we're familiar with any user, any device, any location. We're used to that little slogan. Workspace is the same thing. Any user, any device, any location, also any resource, apps, desktops, data, and any cloud. All of these resources can be running anywhere. They could be running in your on-prem data center. They could be running in any cloud. They could be running from a SaaS vendor, in their environment, wherever that might be. But that's really kind of what the workspace is, and that's why it's so much more complex than it was before in the Windows 3 days, is many devices, many different operating systems, and those applications are no longer local. Those applications are running locally, virtually, and as SaaS and web apps. The data is no longer local. The data is local or in the cloud or in multiple clouds at the same time. So it's a lot more complex. And this, we talk about the Citrix Workspace quite a while, and these are all kind of the capabilities that we currently see as the workspace, and we're gonna be touching on some of these, as we go through this master class. For those of you who are more interested in kind of seeing architecturally how some of these pieces fit together, there's the whole Citrix Workspace poster that we've developed. So something else you will be able to access, and we'll get the link out there to people as well to get access to the Workspace poster, so you can kind of see how all these different capabilities or all these different components, conceptually how they fit together. Now that we have kind of a high-level understanding of a workspace, I really want to focus on the building blocks. How do you begin? When you hear people talk about the workspace, it sounds really great, but there's a lot that goes into your workspace. All the different types of applications you can have, and all the different types of resources you can have. So what I really want to do is focus this masterclass on how do we actually build out the environment, because I want to see how easy or difficult this is going to be. And so the first thing we want to talk about is Workspace App, because this is really I see it as the central point for getting access to the user's overall workspace is the app. So Workspace App, again, for those of you who are familiar with virtual apps and desktops, you can think of this as receiver, but there's more to it than Citrix Receiver. Workspace App, it again runs on any platform, just like Receiver did, but it includes a whole host of engines that have different capabilities. So one of the interesting ones, which we'll see a little bit later, is an embedded browser engine. So this is going to give us access to SaaS and web applications. We're not going to launch a published app for every SaaS and web app that's out there. We want to try to give this native local experience to SaaS and web applications while still giving better security than you would with a local traditional browser of Firefox, Chrome, Edge, IE. Some of the other engines, of course, the HDX or the IC engine, this is the virtual apps and desktops engine. This gives you access to those type of resources. But there's also content collaboration engine that's going to give us access to different storage repositories, whether they're on-prem, whether they're in the cloud, whether it's a SharePoint backend. It's going to give us access to all that data from our central workspace. Networking engines, there's an analytics engine, there's management engines, that's going to help us maintain the endpoint device, maintain Workspace App. The management engine has this auto update capability that's going to make sure all of our Workspace App deployments, on Mac and Linux, or Mac and Windows and Linux are updated. For the Android and iOS platforms, of course, those are automatically updated already, based on the iOS and Android stores. So we're looking at how do organizations maintain Workspace App on devices that are not centralized. These are distributed devices, and they're probably not even owned by the organization. So we have to really focus on how we maintain those applications. So that's one of the engines, is really focusing on the management aspect. Now let's look at Workspace App conceptually. So there are actually 3 different flavors of Workspace App. You have Workspace App for the desktop, Workspace App for mobile devices, and Workspace App for web. And you might be wondering, why 3? Well, it's based on the device. So if I have a corporate device, you're probably going to want to go down the Workspace App, the desktop version. This is deployable. This is an XE package that you can deploy onto those different devices. For phones and tablets, there's a mobile app that you get from the App Store. But then there's also situations where you don't want to install Workspace App, or you can install Workspace App, and it's a traditional device, running Windows or Mac or Linux. In this instance, there's Workspace App for web. And all you need is an HTML5 browser to get the Workspace App experience. Now, regardless of which flavor of Workspace App you use, they all go and talk to the Workspace experience service that's running within Citrix Cloud. Now that service, based on the organization's configuration, pulls in a bunch of resource feeds based on what you subscribe to. So if you are subscribed to a virtual apps and desktop service and the endpoint management service, the resource feed microservice will pull in all of those resources into the user's workspace, and that gets presented down on the endpoint device via the Workspace app. So this all kind of happens automatically, that Workspace is pulling all of these different resources in based on the resource feed. Now, we're not just talking about cloud services here. You can also incorporate your on-prem IT managed virtual apps and desktops environment, your XenApp and XenDesktop. So you can incorporate those applications into your workspace without reconfiguring your on-prem deployment. So if you're currently running XenApp and XenDesktop, or 7.x, or even 6. The 6.5 version, you can incorporate those resources into the workspace without having to reconfigure your on-prem environment. And we'll actually go in a little bit more detail on this a little later when we talk about site aggregation. But high level, that's kind of what's happening here, is we're pulling all these resources together and delivering those into the Workspace app. Now, the next thing we want to take a look at is, I think I went a tad too far. There's a couple design considerations. So when it comes to Workspace app, all those engines, they're not all deployed at once. It's based on, there's basically the overall Workspace app, and then those engines get deployed as needed. So based on the different services that you are subscribed to, as the organization subscribes to, different engines get incorporated into that. There's also many different platforms. Pretty much all the platforms that you're going to need Workspace app, it's available. So there's Windows, Linux, Mac, iOS, Android, Chromebooks, and if you're not on one of those, you got HTML5. So all you need is a browser to get access to Workspace app. So let's, at this point, I think it's time to take a look at Workspace app from the user perspective as well as the admin perspective on how do we set up and configure this. Within our Cloud Console, the first thing we want to make sure is that we already have a resource location defined, and I do. I mean, I've already set up different controllers within the environment, redundant ones. Although one's offline now, but I still have a connection to my on-prem environment. And you can also see that I'm authenticating to my on-prem domain controller. And again, you might be wondering why it's orange, just because I only have one of my cloud connectors running currently. So it's just giving me a warning, but everything should still work. One of the first things you want to do from the admin console is to set up the Workspace URL. And this is going to be the URL that a user is going to enter within the Workspace app. If it's not delivered, if it's not pre-configured for the user, or not using a username. So you want to go ahead and set this, and it's going to take a few minutes for it to propagate throughout the environment. So that's why I've already got it pre-configured. The next thing is to verify that we're using Active Directory to authenticate, and we are. And then we can go ahead and customize the UI. Give it different logos, see how in different colors, and see how it's going to impact the Workspace experience UI, as well as setting different preferences. So we can allow users to select favorite apps or automatically launch desktops if there's only one available. Also want to make sure that we've enabled the correct services that we want to have integrated within this Workspace configuration. So secure browser and gateway. And then finally, sites. And this is something we'll talk about a little bit later on integrating on-prem environments using the sites configuration. So from an admin perspective, there's not a lot to configure. So let's now take a look at the user perspective. And I've already installed the Workspace app desktop version. So I'm going to go ahead and log on. The first thing I need to do, it's unconfigured, is enter in the URL. This is the one we added into our Workspace configuration as the admin. And it's going to go out and contact that URL, and it's going to then ask me to authenticate. And so this will be my on-prem Active Directory identity. And it's going to use the cloud connectors that I have deployed in my on-prem environment to make that connection to my on-prem Active Directory environment. And once the authentication happens, you're going to see my Workspace is going to load. Now, when you see this, it's empty. And we haven't configured anything yet. All we have right now is a Workspace, but we're going to add apps in just a moment. Now let's go back to our building blocks, and let's focus on virtual apps and desktops. Because many of you who are attending, I'm guessing, are already have a XenApp and XenDesktop environment implemented within your environment. But so this is really where most of you are going to be starting from. I have an on-prem XenApp XenDesktop environment. I want to get to Workspace. I need to integrate this into my Workspace environment. And like anything, there's a couple different ways that you can do this. So what we're trying to do is we want the user to access the workspace experience that's running in Citrix Cloud, and we need to be able to pull in our on-prem virtual apps and desktop environment, our on-prem Zen app and Zen desktop environment into our workspace. So we got to figure out, how do we do this? The first way is using the virtual apps and desktop service, which requires some reconfiguration of your on-prem environment to be able to incorporate those applications and desktops. When you do this, it's all managed within the cloud. The control plane goes in the cloud, and it's managed in the cloud. The other way is to use site aggregation, where Workspace running in Citrix Cloud actually is able to pull in those resources running in your on-prem environment. Let's dig down a little deeper and see conceptually what this actually means. So here's what your typical on-prem IT managed virtual apps and desktop environment is going to look like. The user accesses gateway, give them that secure connection. We get to storefront to get a list of all of our resources, contacts the delivery controller to figure out which resource you have access to. It authenticates you, and it delivers that resource to you, via ICA. And then you have all these other components out there that support the environment: license server, database, and director and studio. Now, when you go with the virtual apps and desktop service, what ends up happening is all those control items are removed. You can decommission those from your on-prem environment, and we use services running in Citrix Cloud that you subscribe to, the virtual apps and desktop service as well as the gateway service. So we get rid of all that infrastructure that's running on-prem and that the IT team has to manage, and instead what we do is we replace that with a cloud connector. Now, that cloud connector allows those cloud services to talk to our on-prem environment, because we're probably authenticating with Active Directory, so we need to be able to authenticate to the on-prem Active Directory environment. Those services need to be able to communicate with the Windows apps and the Windows desktops and the Linux apps, all the different VDAs. So this is allowing us to securely communicate with those on-prem resources, via the cloud services. But that requires you to reconfigure your on-prem environment. And many of you who are running a virtual apps and desktop environment, spend a lot of time. You already have machines allocated. You've got gateway servers running. You've sized these things. You've optimized them. You've got the DR in place. Everything's running really good. So you don't really want to change it. So with site aggregation, you don't have to. Site aggregation, you can keep your on-prem environment and incorporate Workspace. So now what happens here is we still need to add a cloud connector to your on-prem environment, because Workspace that's running in Citrix Cloud, this is only for Citrix Cloud, has to still be able to talk to the delivery controller that's running on-prem, because that is how Workspace will be able to get a list of all the resources that users have access to. The cloud connector is also going to be talking with Active Directory to make sure that Workspace authenticates you to your Active Directory domain. Again, we don't want to change anything on-prem. All we're doing is we're adding a cloud connector machine, redundant machines into your on-prem environment, and leaving your on-prem environment as is. We don't have to reconfigure any of these components in order to incorporate Workspace into this. The other option is maybe you are retiring gateway, or you haven't provided that remote access yet. So what you can also do is remove the gateway, Citrix Gateway that's running on-prem, and replace it with the gateway service that's running in the cloud. Again, you still need the cloud connector on-prem, but now you're using the gateway service that will give you that remote access to this on-prem environment. But regardless of which approach you take, you've got to have the cloud connector, because that is the link between your on-prem environment and Citrix Cloud, Citrix Workspace that runs in Citrix Cloud. With this, there's a couple different ways you can deploy it. So first, let's say you want to use the gateway service. I can have one site defined that's going to give the user access, remote access, and where we use the gateway service. I can also have another site defined within the same workspace using an on-prem Citrix gateway. You're running in the on-prem environment to give users in that location access remotely. And then I can also have another environment, another site that does not allow any remote access. And so you can set this up, different criteria on how you break this up. But from one workspace, you can use the gateway service in the cloud. You can use Citrix Gateway running on-prem, and then you can also have another environment that's set up with no remote access at all whatsoever. Now that, architecturally, you've kind of seen how site aggregation works, let's actually go through and configure it and see how this impacts the overall user experience, the overall experience that a user gets within Workspace App. So let's flip back over to our lab environment and we go back into our workspace configuration. One of the items in here that we skipped last time was sites, and this is where we're going to deploy and configure site aggregation. So select the version of virtual apps and desktops, and then the resource location. Now we enter in the URL for our on-prem delivery controller. And the discovery is going to go through the cloud connector and identify that, and we need to be able to enter credentials that will allow us to authenticate to that delivery controller. Once the authentication succeeds, we'll be able to continue along with this wizard. So the next part is verifying how we're going to authenticate, with Active Directory, and then defining our gateway. So if you want to use the gateway service, you basically leave it as is. But here we have an on-prem gateway environment already configured, so now we just need to select it and enter in the fully qualified domain name of the gateway. Now it's just a matter of verifying all of our settings and then saving the configuration. So fairly easy to configure site aggregation. The last part of the configuration is only applicable if you're using an on-prem gateway. We need to add the STA, the Secure Ticket Authority, for our cloud connector into our gateway configuration. So go ahead and log into NetScaler and go to the gateway configuration for the virtual server, and we're going to go ahead and make that change. So there's already going to be STAs defined for the on-prem environment. We want to leave that alone. Like I said, we're not going to change anything that's going to impact the production environment. What we need to do is add additional STAs for each one of your cloud connectors. And when you go ahead and configure this, you just want to make sure that after you add them in there that they do turn green, that they are available. Now once this is done, site aggregation is complete, even with the on-prem gateway environment. Now let's flip over to the user side and see how this impacts Workspace App, the user's workspace experience. So here we'll just go ahead and within Workspace App and refresh. And this will take a moment to contact the on-prem delivery controller and generate a list of all of our resources. So there you go. Now you can see we have the workspace has been expanded based on the services we have. We haven't set up any favorites yet because this is a new user. So we'll go into the apps and the desktops and take a look at all of the apps that we have. And this is coming from the on-prem environment that we've authenticated to, that we set up with site aggregation. So we'll go ahead and create a couple favorites here, selecting the star. Just make it easier for the rest of the master class to be able to access and see some of these applications from the Workspace App home screen. We can also do the same thing on the desktop side. So our primary desktop, we can go ahead and favorite that, so it'll just be available within our environment. And you can see as we navigate through Workspace App, the favorites now appear in these newer locations, making it easier for a user to access. Now, that's Workspace App for the desktop. Let's take a look at Workspace App Web and see the differences we could observe between the two. So go ahead and enter the URL and authenticate. And the UI is very similar. You can see even our favorites are the same. because this is all being stored up in the cloud. So we go side by side here with Workspace App and Workspace Web, and you can see the UI is pretty much identical. It's the same format, the same menu structures, even the same interactions within that menu. And selecting the different ones, we get the exact same resources. So this is one of the key things with Workspace App is to, regardless of the type of device you're using, the experience should be the same. So that's Workspace App Desktop and Workspace App Web. Let's take a look at Workspace App Mobile. So I'm going to go ahead and enable it so I can show my mobile device on this machine, so we can see what Workspace App Mobile looks like. Okay, we can see my mobile device now, and we'll go ahead and launch Workspace App, and I've already got the store configured, the same URL that we've used everywhere else. As you can see, the UI is the same. We have the favorites, we have our menu structure, the same services that we've already subscribed to are now available, and we have the exact same applications. So overall, regardless of Workspace App Desktop, Web, or Mobile, it's the same UI. Okay, the next step in our building block discussion is access control. So what exactly is access control? So conceptually, from our diagram, we have a user accessing Workspace, either using the Virtual Apps and Desktop service or site aggregation, but it's giving us access to Windows and Linux desktops and apps, virtual apps and desktops. So we've incorporated that into our environment. The next big pain point when it comes to Workspace, from my perspective, are SaaS and web apps. So I was recently counting, I have probably now over 175 different accounts and passwords. Most of these are for different web and SaaS applications that are out there that I work with, or different just websites. It's becoming very difficult to try to access my resources. I don't remember what half of the passwords are, or even the user accounts, so you have to use third-party password managers to try to memorize these things for you. But we want to look at is how do we incorporate, how do we integrate those type of apps easily into our workspace, so it's easy for users to get access to from any device. And this is what access control is. We have passwords for everything, and they're all different. Any application, any web application you're subscribing to, you are going to have some form of identification that you have to deal with. And this becomes extremely difficult trying to manage and maintain. At least for me personally, when I access any SaaS app, I usually have to do a forgot password, or even I forgot my username, because sometimes it's not what I typically would think would be my username for some reason. But it's very difficult to try to figure this out. Also with access control is because we're using SaaS and web applications, those applications are no longer within the data center. IT doesn't have control over it. They don't have control of the data of those SaaS and web apps. So if you don't have control of the data, how do you prevent a user from sticking in a USB thumb drive and copying customer data, copying sales data, and taking it with them to another employer? The other thing is phishing. Within web apps, within SaaS apps, you probably, the mentality a lot of people have is, look, this is Salesforce.com. I trust that web app, which, that's fine. But what about the information within the app? What about any hyperlinks that a user might access within the app? And for those of you, if you're not familiar with Salesforce.com or even some of these other SaaS apps like Humanity.com and GoToMeeting.com, what about Outlook, Office 365? Those are SaaS web apps. You get URLs, you get hyperlinks within Outlook that's running in the cloud as a SaaS app. What happens when a user clicks on it? Well, hopefully it's a trusted URL, but this website is a phishing website for Facebook. The URL is not correct, but it looks pretty close. I mean, the screen looks identical to Facebook.com, but the URL, unless the user's paying attention to it, is going to be entering in information that they probably don't want to, except for Facebook. So we're trying to look at SaaS apps from a single sign-on perspective, from preventing loss of data, as well as trying to protect users from bad sites, bad websites. So how this works? First, there's a lot that goes into access control, and I'm hopefully we won't get too confused here. I got a lot of different diagrams to try to explain this at different levels of detail, just so we get a better understanding of all that access control can do. So at a high level, this assumes you're using Workspace App. So a user selects a link within Workspace App. Now, if you have a capability within access control called enhanced security, if it's turned off, and I launch a SaaS application from Workspace App, it's going to go ahead and launch in my local browser. Whatever my preferred browser, Edge, Chrome, Firefox, it doesn't matter. It's just going to launch normally. But it will single sign me onto that SaaS application. Now, if I turn enhanced security on, what happens is the SaaS app launches within an embedded browser. Remember when we talked about Workspace App, there's all those different engines that were there. One of them is an embedded browser. When you have enhanced security turned on and you access a SaaS app via Workspace App, the desktop, you get the embedded browser, or Workspace App, desktop or mobile, you get the embedded browser. Now, with enhanced security on and accessing the environment in the embedded browser, the first thing you'd probably see is there's a watermark. So you can have a watermark enabled or disabled with enhanced security. Also, with any URL within the SaaS application, it's going to be analyzed before the user clicks on it. And you can set up different categories and different specific URLs to say, if a user selects this category or this specific URL, I want you to deny access. For these categories or URLs, I want you to allow access, and the embedded browser go ahead and access it. For other URLs, you can redirect it, and the redirection happens and it goes to the Citrix Secure Browser Service, which is a published browser. So you can allow, deny, or redirect specific URLs or categories. And we'll go a little bit more of this, different categories later. Now, Workspace Web, so that was Workspace App, desktop or mobile. Workspace Web, on the other hand, things happen a little differently. So enhanced security turned off, you access an app via Workspace Web, the HTML5 browser, we're going to connect to that SaaS app with our local browser as a new tab. If you have enhanced security turned on, instead of launching the embedded browser, because there is no embedded browser engine when you use Workspace Web because it's just HTML5, what we're going to do instead is open up in a secure browser, a published browser running in the cloud. And from within that secure browser, again, we can enable and disable different functionalities, part of the enhanced security policies, including what you see there is the watermark. We still do the URL filtering. So we can deny access to certain URLs or categories. We can allow access, and we also redirect, which, think about it, before when we use Workspace App, a redirection meant that I'm going to open up in a secure browser published app. I'm already in a secure browser published app with Workspace Web, so a redirect just isn't allowed because it detects, hey, you're already running a secure browser session, so this is a redirection to secure browser. You're already running a secure browser. We're going to go ahead and allow it instead of launching another secure browser session. So some intelligence built into it. So let's now, that's high level. Let's dig a little deeper, and first let's talk about single sign-on. Single sign-on to SaaS applications. And there's a couple different, there's what I see as about 3 main capabilities within access control. And this one is single sign-on to the SaaS application. So we have the user, they have an identity, and that identity gets them access to Workspace. Now, Workspace should then automatically give them access to any of the other applications they've been provided access to, that they've been approved for access. I shouldn't have to authenticate anymore once I've logged into my Workspace. So with enhanced security turned off, what happens is, if I have Workspace App, so in this scenario we're going to talk about Workspace App. User launches Workspace App. Workspace App talks to the Workspace Experience service running in Citrus Cloud. Gives you a list of your applications. Those applications, show up in your Workspace App, and the user clicks on one. When the user clicks on an application, that request goes from your Workspace App to the Workspace Experience. Workspace Experience then asks the gateway service, hey, I need a one-time use URL and the preferred browser for this launch request. Gateway service sends this back. That information is accessed by Workspace App. Now, the preferred browser, in this instance, because enhanced security is turned off, is going to be your local browser. And it uses that one-time use URL. It goes back to the gateway service and says, hey, gateway service uses the single sign-on microservice to get an assertion for this user. So we're doing SAML authentication here, and the assertion is saying that this user with this attribute, which is email address, is allowed access to this application. So it gives you this token, this assertion that gets sent back to our local browser. Within that information that gets sent back is the URL that the browser is now supposed to access, which is specific to the SaaS app for SAML authentication. When that assertion is presented to that SaaS app URL, the SaaS app knows I need to validate this assertion with the gateway service, and it presents that assertion back to the gateway service to successfully authenticate the user. So SSO with enhanced security off, this is how it kind of works, a little bit more detail. Now, the green line we're going to show here is I don't have Workspace App. I'm using an HTML5 browser to access Workspace Web. So again, you access Workspace, you sign on, you get a list of your applications. You select an application, that request goes to the gateway service, which says, I need a one-time use URL and a preferred browser for this user. Preferred browser, again, enhanced security is turned off, so it's going to be your local browser. Local browser contacts the gateway service. It gets the assertion for the user, proving they are who they say they are. It also gets, the URL for that SaaS application. The browser contacts the SaaS app, presents the assertion. The SaaS app then knows to go back, contact the gateway service to revalidate that assertion that the user presented. So, again, Workspace App in local browser with enhanced security off, the overall experience is the same, and the overall process is pretty much the same, from the user perspective. So I think it's, at this point, let's go and do a demo of access control. Let's see how we configure it. Let's see the user experience of access control as well. So for this first part, we're really just going to focus on the single sign-on to the SaaS applications. And from here, we're going to go ahead and do our gateway service that's been allocated to us. Go ahead and configure single sign-on. And here you can see the list of the templates that we have already pre-built to make it easier to configure SSO. So we'll go ahead and select Humanity for the Humanity application. Go ahead and give it a name. And here in the URL, you see the customer domain. So this is unique for each customer who uses Humanity. So in my instance that I have, it's snpp1.humanity.com, and that's my custom URL. We're not going to use enhanced security just yet. We'll go back and configure this a little bit later. Now this last part here is usually the trickiest part, but again, it's a template, so we go ahead and configure the assertion URL, remove company name and put in our domain name. And then we have to look at this metadata file because this includes the information that we need to input into our SaaS application. And we'll go ahead and do this by first logging into the SaaS app, as an administrator, someone who can configure the environment. And you have to go in the settings. And this is going to be different for every SaaS application that's out there. Sometimes you have to contact someone, or you have to figure out how to do it, or you figure out where it is on your own. So we go ahead and enable SAML. We take some of the information from the metadata file, the entity ID URL, as well as the X509 certificate, and we go ahead and add this into the SaaS application. And this is going to give us that link back to Gateway, so the SaaS application can validate the assertion against the provider, against the entity that actually created that assertion, so we can go ahead and validate. And that's going to be the gateway. So that's why we entered all this information within the SaaS application. So if we look at that assertion URL, and again, I changed the company name to match mine, you can see that it matches inside the SaaS application. The fully qualified domain name includes samuelconsume.php. This is unique for the Humanity application, and it's matched within the configuration of my SaaS application. The other thing to take note of this screen is the name ID format. So we're using an email address, and the name ID is the email. That is the link from my Active Directory that I am using as my principal to the user account within the SaaS application. So it's based on email address. And you can pick different parameters, but in this instance, I'm going to go ahead and use email. The next thing we need to do is configure who has access to the SaaS application. So we go into our library, and the SaaS app should now appear, and we'll go ahead and manage subscribers. And essentially, you pick either a user account or preferably a domain group within our Active Directory domain, and any user within that group will have access to the SaaS application. So when we go back to our user and refresh Workspace App, we should be able to see this application appear. Once the app appears, let's go ahead and test it to make sure single sign-on works. So there, because we're not using enhanced security, it's using the local browser, and the user has been successfully authenticated to the SaaS app. So we've configured single sign-on correctly in this case. Let's now look at enhanced security, because enhanced security is going to give us, it's going to impact this overall architecture here. It's going to impact how this thing works. So again, we access Workspace App. We'll go a little bit faster here because this doesn't change. We get a list of our apps. We select an app. That request goes to the gateway service. Now this time, we get the one-time use URL and the preferred browser. Because Workspace App, or because enhanced security is turned on and we're using Workspace App, the embedded browser within Workspace App uses that one-time use URL to contact the gateway service. Gateway service gets the assertion for the user via the single sign-on microservice, plus it gets enhanced security policies via the access control service that runs in the cloud. And those all those things go back and impact how the embedded browser looks and behaves. Do I have navigation? Is there a watermark? Can I print? Can I copy? Can I have my drives mapped? So those access control policies impact the functionality of the embedded browser. So the embedded browser gets the URL from the gateway service as well as the assertion. Those policies are applied to that embedded browser. Information sent to the SaaS application. We provide that assertion of our identity, and then the SaaS app validates that assertion with the gateway service. Let's look at now using the Workspace Web local browser. This whole process remains the same. The one-time use URL and the preferred browser this time, we had enhanced security turned off. The preferred browser is local browser. Now with enhanced security turned on, using Workspace Web or local browser, HTML5 browser, the preferred browser is the secure browser service, the published browser running in the cloud. After this, the rest of the process is the same. The secure browser service uses that one-time use URL to get to the gateway. Gateway gets our assertion from the single sign-on microservice. The gateway also gets the access control policies that's going to help lock down and configure the browser service, watermarking, drive mappings, navigation buttons. The browser service then contacts the SaaS app, provides our assertion of who we are, identifying who we are, and the SaaS app goes back and validates that with the gateway service. So a little bit more to it when we turn on enhanced security. We're introducing the embedded browser, we're introducing the access control service and some of the policies, and we're introducing a secure browser service just by turning on the enhanced security capability. Now I mentioned secure browser a couple times. Let's make sure we understand what this is. So a traditional browser, it's running on your endpoint. User accesses internet, bad stuff goes down to your endpoint. I no longer trust your endpoint. Secure browser, on the other hand, basically the browser now is running as a published application in the cloud, a disposable environment, a disposable VM. So I'm accessing internet sites from a published browser, and when I'm done with my session, that browser goes away and gets destroyed. But this leaves my endpoint fine. This also helps protect the environment because IT doesn't know if your endpoint should be trusted. But with IT policies, we can lock down the secure browser better than we could on an untrusted endpoint device, on a personal endpoint device. So this gives us a little bit better security when we access, SaaS and web applications via a browser. At this point, let's now go back to our environment and let's go ahead and enable enhanced security to see what impact this now has on the user experience. So we're going to go back and edit the SaaS application configuration within our workspace. And we'll leave all the app details and everything, the single sign-on correct or as was, and we're going to go ahead and change the enhanced security, and we're going to go ahead and enable this. We are going to allow the user to navigate, so we'll have the navigation button still within our browser. And we just accept all the other configurations for the SaaS application. We're just turning on enhanced security. Now we go back to Workspace App and make sure we're in the app and not the browser. We're going to do both to see the impact it has. So for the app, we go ahead and start the application, Humanity. And this time we're not using a local browser anymore. We're now using the embedded browser. So by turning enhanced security on, we use embedded browser instead of local browser. You also can see the watermark. Let's now do the exact same thing within Workspace App Web within our browser. So go ahead and launch the application. And here, instead of using our local browser, you can see a secure browser session is initiating. This is a published browser that Citrix manages. And it just appears as a new tab within your local browser, but this is running on a remote system somewhere else. But just like before, the user's automatically signed on to our SaaS application, and the watermark appears. The next thing I want to try is to access Humanity via Workspace App Mobile from my mobile device. So let's go ahead and get my phone reconnected to the desktop so we can go ahead and see the screen. Okay, we'll go ahead and get into Workspace and select the right store and launch the application. And again, like before, it'll single sign us on, and it should be using enhanced security still. On the mobile device, though, what we'll see is that it will utilize, right now it's going to utilize the secure browser service. The embedded browser doesn't exist in the mobile device, so we're going to use the secure browser service to access the app. But once the app launches within secure browser service, it's going to function just like it was that you were using Workspace Web, the web version of the Workspace app. So you'll be able to get all the same links. It'll single sign you on. When you select a link that's denied, it's going to deny you access to that link. Since you're on the mobile device, you're going to be able to zoom in and zoom out and navigate with touch, just because it's the common way you're going to navigate on mobile and touch-enabled devices. All right, single sign-on, enhanced security, and now web filtering. So this is the third aspect of access control. I said there are going to be three, and this is number 3, is web filtering. So we're back to our conceptual diagram here. Now with web filtering, you as the user select a link within the SaaS application. That link gets sent, and before it's opened by your embedded browser, this assumes you're using Workspace App, that link gets analyzed by the access control service, or it's intercepted by the access control service, which then forwards it to the web filtering microservice that determines, what do I do with this link? Is it a safe site? What is the rating of the site? Has it already been approved or denied by the organization? And whether it's been approved or denied, it could be denied access, we could be allowed access, or we could be redirected to that URL via the secure browser service. Now, when I use Workspace Web, I already have that connection. I'm accessing the SaaS app via the secure browser service. So when I select a link within the secure browser service, that link gets intercepted by the browser. It gets forwarded out to the access control service where we analyze it by the web filtering microservice. And the same thing happens. Did I deny it? Do I allow it? Or do I redirect it to the secure browser service, which means it allows it? So using URL, the web filtering as part of enhanced security, you get that capability in there as well, as to protect the user from any URL that's within the SaaS application. Let's now flip back to our environment and let's go ahead and configure the URL filtering capability. So in this case, we're now going to go in the access control service and go ahead and configure the content access. So we go ahead and edit, and here we basically are setting up different categories that we want to allow or deny. So this one we're going to deny malware, spam, peer-to-peer, BitTorrent sites. We're going to deny adult, gambling, anything illegal and harmful. On the redirection for a category, we're going to redirect social networking. So Facebook, Twitter, Google. But you know what? Let's say we don't want to redirect Twitter, but we do want to redirect everything else when it comes to social networking. So here we can go ahead and specifically allow a URL. So we're going to allow star.twitter.com. So this should allow a user to get access directly to Twitter, but any other social media apps get redirected to secure browser. At this point, now that's configured, we can go back into the user side and see what happens to our environment, see what the user experience is going to be. So we'll launch the application and single sign us on with enhanced security. And we're going to go ahead and launch the Twitter link that's within our SaaS app. So this should be allowed based on our configuration. That's not exactly what we were hoping to see. This is actually good because it's showing that there are some special configurations and nuances you have to do when doing URL filtering. So it did allow us to get to Twitter, but it's not rendering correctly, probably because we're missing a URL that Twitter is using that we're just not aware of. So let's now go back as the admin and let's troubleshoot why this application is not working correctly. So this time we're going to go to twitter.com, and that's how the page should look. So let's now go to Tools and Developer Tools. And here we're going to be able to see a list of sources, a list of locations that Twitter's getting information from. So based on this list, we have an entry here for twing.com. So if we go back into the configuration, we can go and add this as another allowed website because it's related to Twitter. And this should allow us to get the full experience of Twitter within our embedded browser. So with that configuration done, let's go ahead and retest. Go back into the SaaS app, and we're gonna select that Twitter hyperlink to see what happens. Hopefully, it actually renders correctly. Okay, that did solve the issue. So we were just missing that one link. Let's look at piratebay.org. This is a torrent site that was denied. So the URL for the category blocking that we set for peer-to-peer and torrents also worked as well. The last thing within Workspace App I want to test is Facebook. So this was social networking category that we said to redirect. And so this looks like it's opening up in secure browser, starting the connection, and this should get us to facebook.com. And there we go. So all of those were within Workspace App. Now let's change things a little bit. Let's go to Workspace Web. And we're going to go ahead and launch Humanity again. And because enhanced security is enabled, this is going to launch a secure browser session for the entire SaaS application. Now ideally, all the settings that we did before would also work here. So we selected Pirate Bay, that should be denied, and everything else should basically be allowed. So go ahead and test Pirate Bay, and there you go. The URL filtering is working. All right, when it comes to the web filtering, there's some design considerations we need to think about. Or actually, now it's beyond web filtering too. It's more or less access control. So there's application level definitions as well as service level definitions. Service level is the entire access control. Application level definitions are specific to the SaaS or web application. So the single sign-on configuration is specific to that SaaS or web app, of course. Every SaaS app is going to be different. The enhanced security, do I use the embedded browser, secure browser? Do I allow or disallow navigation, the watermark, and all those things? Those are specific for each SaaS and web app definition that we create. Now the web filtering, on the other hand, which websites are allowed or denied, those are service-wide. Those are for the entire workspace. So you define this for the workspace, and they're applied to every single SaaS and web application you've defined in your environment that's using enhanced security. And that's the key. Those SaaS and web apps, in order to utilize the web filtering, must have enhanced security enabled. That allows us to handle the web filtering capabilities. Now, the analysis of those web links. You might be looking at, with being able to allow and deny and redirecting URLs as well as whole categories, what's the whole precedence? Which one has more priority over the other one? So when we begin the URL analysis, what we end up seeing is first, we look at the URL as part of the web filtering microservice, and is that URL specific to Citrix Cloud Services? If it is, regardless of what you put, it will be allowed. So if you deny access to cloud.com, you're going to break things. So we've already got to configure that you can't break things. You can't break the cloud services. So those services or those URLs related to Citrix Cloud Services, those are always allowed no matter what you put. Also, if a URL is associated with the SaaS application, so example, the SaaS app I showed you is humanity.com. If you try to, in web filtering, deny access to star.humanity.com, it will be allowed. The user will be able to get access to that URL because that's part of your SaaS app that you've defined. You wouldn't block that URL to an application that needs access to that URL. All right, so now we get into the actual more specific items that the admin configures that will actually have an impact. First, if the user blocks a specific URL, that's the next highest level of priority, and it will be blocked. After that, if you redirect it, it gets redirected, and then if you allow it, it gets allowed. So specific URLs have priority over categories. So if I block a category, then it's blocked. Then if I redirect it, it's then redirected. And if I allow it, it's allowed. So block has priority over redirect and allow. Redirect has a priority over and allow. Specific URLs have priority over specific categories. Now, if we go through, you click a link and we go through the whole URL analysis here and we still haven't gotten a hit on one of these blocks, then the configuration is to allow access to that URL. So if it's not defined, we go ahead and allow access. So those are a couple of the building blocks. So we talked about Workspace App, virtual apps and desktops, and access control. So we look at the architecture and we pull this all together. We're able to get access to our virtual apps and desktops via the virtual apps and desktop service or site aggregation. We're able to get access to our SaaS and web applications via the access control service. We're able to get access to our published browser, our secure browsers, via the secure browser service. So what's left when it comes to our overall workspace? Local apps. How do I handle local apps on my endpoint devices? Are those Android? Are those iOS? Are those Windows applications? How do I handle those applications? How do I handle storage apps? How do I handle access to my data, regardless of which storage app am I using? And for that, those are going to be the endpoint management service as well as the content collaboration service. And I have to be continued because we just don't have enough time to talk about this in an hour and a half. So in a future masterclass, we're going to continue building out our workspace to include local apps and storage apps with the endpoint management and the content collaboration service. So with that, I think we have some time to open it up for some Q&A.
All right, let me take a look and see what questions have come in during this. So I'm just going to go in order, or at least the ones I'm able to answer. So the first one is app probing. A lot of the first ones are going to be about app probes. So it's about how's it going to impact IOPS? The storage performance. It's just going to be a user logging in and launching the application and then logging off. So IOPS is just going to be whatever that process would take. So you're not going to be running heavy storage processes at that time, and it's only a single user. So it will impact IOPS from a single user, but hopefully not something that you'll actually notice that's going to impact the environment overall. Let's see. Can you set up app probes by GPO? Unfortunately, not. As far as I know, you can. It's only you can only do it through the director configuration. I'm hoping I need to look into this to see if you can do it via PowerShell or not to try to make it easier, especially if you have a lot of app probes. I don't know if that's possible, but that's something I'll take a look at because I'm actually curious about that as well. Can the app probe alarms be sent to other event management tools? So when you set it up, you can actually have it email you if there's a failure. And with Director in general, you can configure Director for different email alerts and different integrations. So I know there is an integration with SCOM with System Center Ops Manager. I would assume the errors or the probe results, because it's in Director, would actually go through there, but that I'm not 100% sure on. That's something else I got to take a look at. But I do know with the configuration of the app probes, you can actually have it set to email you. The HTTP basic, does it mean name and password or in clear text? So one of the requirements on doing app probes is, what you saw is I had to change or I didn't have to change it, but I had to add a authentication method of HTTP basic for that storefront site. So what that basically means is that it's a way to authenticate that doesn't require like a logon page or using cookies or anything like that. You're essentially logging in using the headers within the actual request, within the user request. So that information, the username and password, would be in that HTTP request going across the wire. Now, is it unencrypted? Well, we would, it is encrypted, even with the basic, but you can decrypt it fairly easily. So that is why you would have that link. That's why you would have your storefront site to be encrypted with SSL or TLS encryption, and then that's going to then encrypt the complete, that complete communication, so people won't be able to steal that password. So a couple aspects to that question is the HTTP basic just means that you don't have. It means that you can log in without a logon page. HTTP basic doesn't really impact is the stuff in clear text. That's just standard, HTTP traffic, and that's why you would say use SSL or TLS for that link, which you'd be able to do with HTTP basic authentication. Hope that one makes sense. Let's see, the probes. can you let these things run regularly once an hour? Actually, I see another one that's somewhat similar to this. Like how often can they run? So it's all based on how you configure it. Unfortunately, you have to select a time. Right now there isn't anything that says, can you run hourly? Can you run, twice a day? Can you pick multiple times? You can only pick one. That's why I actually want to go and see if PowerShell, if you can set the app probes with PowerShell, because that would just make things a lot easier. Because then you could just create a very easy PowerShell script to create 24 different probes inside of Director, one for each hour, versus doing it manually. But I'll find out on the whole PowerShell question and put that out there, and probably in a future blog. Let's get down to, that's enough on probes. Let's get down to the next topic, was virtual apps and desktops. Do we need to have the cloud version? So if I have on-prem virtual apps and desktops, do I need to have the cloud virtual apps and desktop service? At least I think that's what that means. No. So that's actually that's one of the reasons why we have the site aggregation now, is because there are a lot of you out there that have a XenApp, XenDesktop, virtual apps, virtual desktop environment built. It's been running for years. You've got all that redundancy. You've got all the planning and the design done. It's running fine. And if we forced you to go down the virtual apps and desktop service to get to use Workspace, that's going to be a huge issue. And there's really no reason for it, for an environment that's already running and you have all those management tools and management processes in place. So getting access to your on-prem environment through Workspace, you don't have to have the virtual apps and desktop service. You don't have to buy that. You just have to use any other service within the cloud, and that's how you end up getting, that's how you end up getting access to Workspace. And then within your Workspace, as you saw, it's just a configuration option. I believe in the example I had, or what I was showing in the demos, I don't believe I actually even had a virtual apps and desktop service assigned to me. It was all those apps that came in when I configured it was my on-prem virtual apps and desktop environment. That's why you probably saw interesting published applications on there like Minecraft and SimCity and City Skylines, because this is actually what I run in my house for my kids. So we got games running on it, and those are the published applications I run. And I was able to integrate that into my Workspace without having a virtual apps and desktop service running. Let's see. Using Workspace app with only on-prem components, is it possible? So yes and no. All right. So yes is that you can use Workspace app, the app itself, to access your on-prem virtual apps and desktop, your XenApp and XenDesktop environment without any cloud resources. What's it going to look like? It's going to look just like Storefront. It's going to look just like your Storefront experience, the Storefront UI that you have right now. What we call the Workspace experience, it's the Workspace UI where you have on the left, you saw the apps and the desktops. If I had content collaboration integrated in with this, you would also have seen the files, all the content and the files and the data of the user in there as well. That right now is just the cloud-hosted Workspace experience. In order to get that, I hope I say this right, is that you have to have a cloud, you have to be subscribed to some cloud service. That could be content collaboration, that could be endpoint management, that could be access control, the Workspace standard. There's different licensing levels, and getting to any of those services gets you access to that whole Workspace experience. I don't typically like talking about the different licensings that are out there because I'm not a salesperson. I usually leave that up to them. But to get that Workspace experience that I showed throughout this whole thing, that you have to use the cloud-hosted version of Workspace. because that's what we call Workspace Experience. If you only have on-prem everything, that means you are looking at your on-prem storefront. You still use Workspace App because receiver that you use right now is replaced by Workspace App. And then Workspace App includes, like we talked about, includes a lot of other capabilities within the environment. So yes, you can use on-prem, but no, you won't get that Workspace Experience interface that you saw throughout most of this masterclass. And I did say that I mentioned like endpoint management and content collaboration. I didn't have that incorporated in there. That's a future one. So stay tuned in Q4 for I guess you'd call it part 2 of this, where we integrate the data, we integrate endpoint management, mobile applications into this whole environment that we're building. Let's see. Now we'll get into some of the SaaS application items here. Does SSO only work with SaaS apps, or can I use it with client-server apps too? Right now, it's only with SaaS apps and web apps. Not, well, at least when you say client-server apps, I'm thinking of like a desktop app. It's SaaS and web apps. So I only showed SaaS apps, and those were the templates that we have. Now, a web app I didn't show, and a web app is going to be something. It's going to be something more custom that you have within your organization, and you'll have to set that up on your own. If you don't use a template, you can go through and on the access control aspect, you can go through and add these things manually without the template, and you can use a on-prem web app. But in order to do that, you do still have to have that cloud connector piece in there. But for a client-server app or a desktop app, no. Right now, it's only for SaaS and web applications. All right, let me see if I can find about one more before we run out of time. The experience, is the experience identical because the embedded browser in Workspace App is what's being used to show the workspace? So let me see if I understand this question. This is being to show the workspace. So the embedded browser in Workspace App, I guess I'm not sure I understand that question. I think I get it. So Workspace App, we have, I showed Workspace App. I showed it, showing the workspace experience within the app, the desktop version. I also showed it Workspace App, the web version, using HTML5. And actually, I confuse myself a lot when I have both of them open at the same time because I can't. It's they're so identical that it's really tough to see the differences. I don't believe it's using the embedded browser there for Workspace App when you're using the Workspace App desktop version. It's just using Workspace App. The embedded browser engine is more or less for the SaaS application to give you that kind of a native experience. So why does it look identical? That's just how they built it. That was one of the big requirements with Workspace App is regardless if I'm on a desktop machine, PC where I have the app installed, or I'm on a mobile device where I have the app installed, or I'm on a HTML, I'm on a device where I don't have the app installed. I can use any browser. We wanted to make sure the experience was identical, so that's basically how they developed it. It's 3 different implementations, but you all get the same identical experience. Now there's a lot more questions. So I'm out of time, but I'm going to stay tuned for hopefully a follow-up blog on these, and I'll have hopefully some answers to more of these questions. A lot of these questions I can't answer, so I got to find the right engineers and the right people in the product group to help me answer some of these things. But stay tuned for a future blog, for for the answers to a lot of these. And then also, stay tuned for Q4 when we do the next Workspace Master Class and keep building this environment out with content collaboration, endpoint management, and maybe a few other things. So stay tuned for there. Thanks a lot.